All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome to our webinar. You're here today for the Connected Library Vetting and Partnering with Social Service Providers. And I'm Caroline Smith, the Inclusive Services Consultant here at the South Carolina State Library. And before we start, I want to acknowledge that our program is sponsored or made possible in part by a Library Services and Technology Act grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is administered by us, the South Carolina State Library. And I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the controls of Zoom by now, but if you need a reminder, you can type in the chat to participate. We may have some time for question and answer where you can unmute yourself as well. And this webinar does have automatic closed captioning, so you can turn that on or off on the bottom of your screen if you would like to use that feature. And we are recording this webinar as well, so for those who registered but cannot attend, and anyone who is in attendance will receive a link within a few business days of the webinar. And with that, I would like to introduce our presenter today, Patrick Lloyd. He was the first public library social worker in Texas, and he currently works as a community resilience consultant for the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. Patrick is an adjunct professor at the University of Texas Steve Hicks School of Social Work and a former co-chair of the PLA Social Worker Task Force. He has presented at ALA, PLA, and the Texas Chapter National Association of Social Workers annual conferences and for information professionals around the country. He lives in Georgetown, Texas with a grumpy beagle. Welcome, Patrick. I'll turn it over to you. Feel free to share your screen.
Thank you, Caroline. And I know that there are a few mouthfuls with that intro, so thank you. And thank you for the invitation to be here as well. And good afternoon to all of y'all. And thank you for being here as well. Let me get my screen shared. And y'all holler at me if you're not seeing my stuff. All right. So good afternoon. Like Caroline said, my name is Patrick. I am a social worker, not a librarian, but I have worked in libraries for 6 years now, both on the ground in the public library for about 5 years. And for the last year or so, I've been at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission, if you're fancy. So today we'll be talking about the connected library. And I know that these days when people think about being connected, oftentimes we're thinking about Wi-Fi, hotspots, internet access, and that sort of stuff. But being a social worker, I'm thinking about connection between people, and particularly today between service providers and us library employees. So we'll be talking about vetting and partnering with social service providers. As we move through this, since we're a relatively small group today, I think just a dozen plus people, please feel free if you have questions specific to a slide or specific to a concept that I'm discussing, feel free to unmute yourself or raise a hand and ask a question. If you have more general questions about kind of, that reminds me of X, Y, and Z at my library, let's save that for the end. And with that, let's get started. So today we'll be talking about why we need to establish partnerships, how to do so. We'll be talking about kind of the tools that I use. There's no kind of, workbook written as far as how to do this. So I'll be giving you the things that I do. Take what works for you, leave the rest. I'll talk a little bit about the things that I see as red flags when I'm looking at community organizations that I'm thinking about working with or referring patrons to. Talking about identifying shared goals with agencies that we have vetted. Right now, that's when we get to the good stuff of the problem solving and serving our community, kind of how we do that, the kind of questions we ask, the things that I think about when I'm in that process. I'll talk a little bit about the good stuff that we were able to do at the Georgetown Public Library when I worked there from 2016 to 2021. And we should have plenty of time for Q&A today. In fact, we might even get you out of here a little bit early, depending on how talkative y'all are, but I'm happy to answer questions till the cows come home. So looking at this slide, COVID-19 is probably going to bring us all sorts of trouble, right? Money problems, abuse problems, substance use problems. And if you're looking at this thinking like, well, duh, Patrick, that is in fact an appropriate response, because I first created this slide for a version of this talk that I gave over 2 years ago in May 2020. And by now, I'm sure all of us are well aware that unfortunately that has come to fruition, right? People are being violent in the hospital, and car thefts are up. And certainly I've seen firsthand that driving seems to be much more aggressive, and that is reflected in the car accident data, certainly for me here in Texas, and I suspect around the country. Homicide rates are up big time in 2020. I suspect we will continue to see that. These are trauma responses, in my opinion, and that's kind of a different talk that I give. But we're seeing essentially a mass trauma response due to the events of the past few years, in my opinion. Cigarette smoking is up for the first time in something like 40 years, right? People smoke when they're anxious. So that tells us that people are probably feeling much more anxious than they did in 2019, right? And on it goes, right? No surprise to any of us at this point. Drug overdoses are way up, workers are burned out, mental health issues in our kids. So all of which is to say, our community's needs are in many ways different than they were in 2019. Our needs, not just as library employees, but just as people, are different. Our coworkers' needs are different. Stuff is different. And I don't think it's going back to whatever we considered normal a few years ago. And so our work has to change as well, right? Because we serve people, we serve communities, and nobody serves people quite like we do. Ooh, excuse me while my leg cramps up. I'm gonna have to start stretching before my webinars. Nobody serves people quite like a library, right? We get to know people, especially those folks who come in 2, 3, 4, maybe times a week, maybe every day. We get to know what they like to read, obviously, but we also get to know a little bit about their living situations or their family situations, or what their kids like to watch on TV, or their favorite sports teams, or how they like their coffee, and all this kind of stuff. We really get to know people in a way that I think is unique in public service, certainly in government public service. I think we get to know folks on a different level. And similarly, community providers, nonprofits, I'll use these terms kind of interchangeably, but I'm essentially talking about social service providers. And our providers really get to know our community as a whole, or perhaps populations within our community really, really well. So while we might know a family or an individual deeply, our providers are going to know pockets of the community, populations of the community really well. And they're good folks to go to when you're like, we're trying to figure out how to serve Spanish-speaking adults with children. There might be an agency who knows that population really well, right? So it behooves us to have a relationship with these agencies, because it makes sense to me, at least, to work together, because we really get to know people and we get to know communities, both of us. And so this work makes sense to me for a variety of reasons, like I just said, but also because often, folks come to libraries seeking information, of course, and a lot of the time that information is contained within the walls of the library, right? Help me find this book. Can you help me with this research? How do I use this computer? And so forth. But for those of us in public libraries, we get lots of other questions, right? I need help finding affordable housing. Is there any pro bono legal aid? How do I sign up for Medicaid? Those sorts of questions that we also get. And those answers are, of course, oftentimes are found outside the walls of the library. And this presents us an opportunity to really liaise, or kind of run back and forth and kind of facilitate relationships between community members or our patrons and social service agencies, basically getting people to the resources that they need. And sometimes, during lots of the talks that I give on various topics, there's sometimes a little bit of pushback that comes in the form of some version of that's not what libraries are for, and perhaps Tina Fey making this face or something like it. And to me, that's an understandable response, because taking good care of our communities, talking about trauma-informed customer service, which I do a lot of, talking about building community partnerships outside the walls of the library. Sometimes the thought is, that's not my job. I signed up to be a librarian. I signed up to be a library assistant. I signed up to be a page. I didn't sign up to become trauma informed and to network with social service providers. In a more perfect world, this work would not be the job of public libraries, but that's unfortunately not the world that we live in. I like to say, it wasn't the original intention of schools. Yeah, other duties as warranted, Garrett, indeed. It wasn't the original intention of schools to provide sex education. It wasn't the original intention of jails to provide mental health care. It wasn't the intention of ERs to rehydrate people who spent too much time in the sun. But those institutions do those things because they have a responsibility to the human beings that are under their roofs. And so again, this stuff, it shouldn't be our job, but it is our responsibility. And of course, with great power, as they say in Spider-Man, comes great responsibility. So in order to live up to this responsibility, we've got to get outside of the building. And I think that sometimes this comes is a little more difficult sometimes for information professionals. I think there's so much stuff we get to do within our libraries, right? It's not just books, it's restaurant recommendations and giving people providing video game tournaments and live music. And we had a wedding at my old library. And so I think there's kind of a tendency to think within libraries, like we can do it all. And yeah, libraries do a lot, right? But we really can't do all of it, right? We need help when it comes to things like mental health issues or drug abuse issues within our buildings and other behavioral concerns and that sort of thing. So when we're thinking about really trying to holistically address the needs of the communities we serve, we got to get outside the building, which doesn't always come naturally, I think, to some folks who have been in librarianship for a while, but we got to get outside the building and make those connections. Because for me, being a public servant, serving communities are really about relationships, not only with the patrons that we serve, but also with the other folks doing good work in the community, like social service providers. And so now we're kind of get into, how do we actually begin this process? And let me kind of, if this is a new concept to you and maybe you're just starting out on this journey, I hope maybe I can alleviate some anxiety you might be having. In my experience, a lot of agencies already understand that many of their clients are library patrons, right? We share these folks. They receive services and resources at our libraries, and they also receive services and resources at social service providers. And I think in my experience, again, when nonprofits and similar agencies hear about library social work, and I saw that there were a couple fellow library social workers on this call today, which is great. They get really excited. They're like, oh, this makes total sense, right? So there's that. Again, like I said, their clients are our patrons and vice versa. And this work, as you do it, it gets easier, right? It's like almost any other thing that we do, shooting a basketball, riding a bike, teaching, whatever. Over time, we get better at it. And so I think that as we continue to do consistent outreach, it's got to be consistent with these organizations. It gets easier because we get to know people, they get to know us, we establish trust. This kind of work is not the sort of thing where you can go to a community meeting once, hand out business cards, and then kind of say, connected to the community. No, again, this is about relationships, and we've got to go consistently. And I know this can be difficult because we're all understaffed, overworked, underfunded, etc. But if this is the kind of work that you are interested in doing at your library, it's got to be something that is ongoing. It can't just be a one-off sort of a deal. So how do we actually begin this process? Where do we start? Well, this is unique for every community. So these are just kind of general suggestions. One thing to do is to get to know what I believe is called in South Carolina, your community mental health center. And this terminology varies state to state. So I'm pretty confident this is correct for South Carolina, but if anybody knows better than I do, and I'm wrong, please tell me. but we're going to link out to this real quick. If you don't know who your community health center is, you can find it right here. Looks like it's regional by county. Looks like your larger counties may have their own community mental health center. The smaller population wise counties seem to kind of double and triple up. But if you're not sure who is your community health center, you can visit this website and find out. Another thing we can do, and I should also say these mental health centers are probably also good sources to receive mental health first aid training. If you've not heard of mental health first aid, it's essentially exactly what it sounds like. It's a training. It's about 8 hours long. It's designed to teach lay people, non-mental health professionals, how to respond to people who are in mental health crisis until first responders, EMTs, mental health professionals can get to that person. So much like first aid, like physical health first aid, is about putting pressure on a wound to keep someone breathing until first responders show up. Similarly, this is the same deal, except we're talking about mental health crises instead of physical health crises. One of the things that community mental health centers may be able to do is to offer you mental health first aid training. If this is piquing your interest and you need a little assistance tracking down the folks to deliver this for you, please reach out to me and I'm happy to help with that as best I can. Another way to kind of start digging your teeth into this stuff is to find coalition meetings, task forces, associations of similar minded agencies within your community. I would guess that many of you are going to have these sorts of things in your city, in your county, in your region. For example, this is one that I used to attend back when I was in the public library. I was serving Williamson County. Georgetown is in Williamson County, Texas. And I would attend regularly a few of these task force meetings, but this is just one example. It's a behavioral health task force. So is talking about mental health issues, substance abuse issues, behavioral health issues, kind of what's going on in the county related to that sort of stuff. And again, when I started attending, people were like, oh my God, the library's here. That makes so much sense. I had no idea that they were interested or paying attention to this and that sort of thing. So again, folks are often excited to see libraries in meetings like this one. Basic needs assistance agencies like food pantries or folks that might help with utility assistance. These are really important. I am almost certain that all of you probably get questions around financial assistance, food assistance, transportation, and that sort of stuff probably every day, right? And it's important that we establish relationships with the agencies that provide those sorts of things, because those sorts of things are so crucial, right, to our health and our development as human beings. And so on the right here, I'm going to blow this back up. On the right, you'll see, for those of you who took psychology in high school or college, you'll recognize this pyramid as being Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Abraham Maslow was an early psychologist, and he essentially theorized that in order for us to reach our full potential, or what he called to self-actualize, we had to climb this pyramid starting at the bottom. And that first and foremost, we of course need to get our physiological needs met, food, water, safety, that sort of thing, safety and security, moving up the ladder, up the pyramid, up another level, intimate relationships and friends and so forth. Our libraries provide a lot of this stuff, right? A lot of the things on this pyramid folks can find in our libraries, and sometimes maybe not. Like, not all of us have food pantries. Not all of us necessarily are able to provide feelings of accomplishment, but we can build relationships with agencies that do that stuff. So it's super important for us to go and visit the food pantry, walk in. What is parking lot? What bus line is it on? If somebody runs into somebody on a bad day at the front desk, who else can they ask to speak to, that sort of thing. It's important that we can direct people in that sort of way so that they can get the basic needs, get their basic needs met. One other link on this slide is a website called findhelp.org, formerly known as auntbertha.com. I think findhelp.org is much more, it explains what they do better. And findhelp.org is kind of like 211 meets Google. If you haven't used 211, it's essentially a nationwide social service resource phone number. That is a great thing to give to people. But if folks want to do their own research, or if you want to do some research into what sort of resources and agencies and service providers exist around you, and you're just kind of starting this process out, this is a good tool for that. So we'll stick with food pantries, for example. This is a Georgetown zip code. And so you see a whole list of kind of needs or issues here at the top. If we were talking about food, we'll go to food pantry, and this will spit out food-related resources moving outward from the zip code that I entered. So the Caring Place, I know them. They are a great food pantry. Again, another program from the Caring Place. I know Helping Hands as well. So you can see this is some good info. However, there is a caveat to this, that the information contained on findhelp.org is only as good as only as accurate as the agencies keep it. So for example, the Caring Place has to update this Caring Place food pantry information when it changes. So again, this is more kind of an introductory tool. It's not like the Bible of social service resources. This is just kind of like, oh, maybe I should reach out to them and learn more. It's important that if we're referring people based off of what we read on findhelp.org, that we are calling those agencies to verify that the information here is still up to date, that the addresses here are still up to date. That is, the address thing is super important when we're serving folks with low incomes for whom gas and that gas money is a major concern, right? We don't want them to get in their car to drive 20 miles to a resource that has closed or has moved or whatever. We have to verify that this information is still up to date. And then, of course, this is easier for those of us who live and work in smaller communities. Who do you already know, right? Perhaps you already know some folks who work at local nonprofits. Perhaps you already know some folks who serve on the boards of agencies. Maybe your coworkers do. Maybe your staff are doing that work or volunteering at agencies. And again, as you do this more often, it gets easier, and we start to know who knows who, and we can say, hey, do you trust so and so? What kind of work do they do? How do they operate? That sort of thing. Yeah, so let's move on. So, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about vetting our partners. And why do we have to do this? Well, the example that comes to mind for me is this photo, or more accurately, the book of which this is a photo of. You can see that these are citations. I hope you can see it. I know it's a little blurry. These are citations, quote unquote citations, from a book published by ALA specifically on serving people experiencing homelessness. And you can see that this citation is in fact no citation at all. Actually, I have absolutely no empirical data for this, but it sounds plausible. I think this is an attempt at humor. I find it extremely unfunny and in fact troubling that this was able to make it through the editors at ALA and to become published. This is kind of to make the point that we have to do our own due diligence when it comes to vetting the folks that we work with, because we can't always trust that big governing bodies who seem to have approved of certain agencies, certain authors in this case, have done their due diligence the same way that we would. I wish that we could do that, but unfortunately that's not always the case, and this is an example of that. So how do we do this? Again, The more you do this, the easier it gets. And once you have a group of agencies, a group of professionals that you trust, you can just reach out to them and say, hey, so-and-so asked to partner with us. What do you think of them? Beyond that, we're also going to check the 501c3 status. That is the IRS designation for nonprofit, apolitical nonprofit organizations. The overwhelming majority of social service agencies that we might partner with. Nonprofits, 501c3s, file tax forms every year called 990s. So if somebody says, I'm with a nonprofit, that they should have 990 forms publicly available. This is a good way to vet them and make sure basically that they are who they say they are. And I'm going to show you how we do this ourselves. It's super easy. There's a variety of websites you can do this on. You can just Google 990 Finder, and I believe it actually takes you right to this website that I'm going to use as an example. Candid. And so it's this easy. Candid itself is a nonprofit. I believe they're in New York. Let's see if I remembered that correctly. Yeah. And they are an extremely well-funded nonprofit as well. So this is Candid's 990 form. And basically there's two things that I'm looking for when I search for an organization's 990. The first and most important thing is, does it exist, right? If somebody's telling me they're a nonprofit agency and they don't have a 990 form, something's not adding up. And I'll get to more of that here in just a few minutes. And once I find that it exists, I'm going to scroll down, usually about a third of the way down. There will be this section, this compensation of officers, directors, trustees, etc. section. So nonprofits have to list their board, and then they also have to list employees who make over a certain amount of money. So when we look at this, we see Candid has a large number of board members, or they call them trustees over here, who are working on average 1 hour a week and who are not being paid. This is all standard nonprofit stuff. This is a large board, a large group of trustees. We've got 2 pages worth of people. We've got, it looks like 15 board members. And then we've got several highly paid employees, very highly paid employees. If anybody wants to go apply for a job at Candid, they seem to pay very well. So when I'm looking at this section, I'm looking for, well, actually, I'm going to get to that in just a few minutes, but these are the 2 most important things I'm looking for with 990s. Does it exist? And then I'm looking specifically for this section as well. And when I look at that section of board members and of highly paid employees, I'm looking for basically diversity on the board or with the trustees. Is it 2 or 3 people? That's not a lot of diversity of opinions, so diversity of experiences, diversity of professional training. I'm usually looking for ideally a board of more than 5-ish people. There's no hard and fast rule here, as we just saw. Candid has 15 people on their board, but I'm looking for 5 or so at least. Again, this is just my rule. This isn't written in stone. I'm also looking to see that the board is made up of folks who are not all from the same family, who are not all from the same company. I don't want this to be some sort of niche passion project for one family. I don't want this to be kind of a social gathering place for people who all work together. Again, I want a diversity of opinions. I want a diversity of community members. I want a diversity of experiences on that board to make sure it's a healthy agency. And again, you might know the people on the boards and not realize it. So it's important to check that out, especially for those of us in smaller communities. Probably goes without saying, we're going to check the agency website, but I'm looking for a few specific things, which I'll cover here in just a few minutes. And then if you have other specific questions, reach out to library social workers. Hopefully there's one near you. If there's not, you can reach out to me and I can try and find out if there's somebody closer to you, or I can try and help you myself. There's probably something like 4 dozen of us or so around the country these days. I have more time on my hands because I work for the state and I don't have to put out the everyday fires like I used to. So either I can help you or I can direct you to somebody who should be able to. Okay, so here are a couple examples of that section regarding officers, directors, and highly paid employees that we were just looking at. And I know this is really small, so I apologize for that. But hopefully, I think I still make the point that I'm trying to make here. So the 990 on the left, we can look at it and we see this is an agency with a board of directors with 15 people on it. You can see I've anonymized this, but they are not related and they do not all work together. And then we also see that the executive director down here, at the very bottom, if you can see it, when I screenshot this, was making $92,000 a year, which is in the ballpark of what I would expect a healthy, well-run agency in Central Texas to pay their executive director. So I look at this and I go, cool. I can check this box, right? There's no red flag on this 990. On this form from on the right side, we look at it. It's a similar section. We see that there are only 3 people on this board. I happen to know that they are related. Curiously, they also do not list any hours per week worked in these positions, and no one is listed as being paid. Both of these agencies are legit. And I know that based on the outreach that I did to them back when I worked at the Georgetown Public Library. The difference, however, is that the agency on the left, it has been around since the 80s, is well established, and is probably the most famous nonprofit in my area. So they've got a long history, they're well established, they're well funded, and all that good stuff. The agency on the right, when I screenshot this, was like 2 years old. So they didn't have paid staff. They were volunteer driven. They were new. So the fact that they only have 3 people listed and there are these kind of discrepancies with hours and pay and all of this stuff, that doesn't mean that they are illegitimate. It just means that I have some questions for them, right? I'm going to say, hey, I was just, looking at your 990 and I realized that your board's really small and no one's paid and blah, blah, blah. Can you help me understand what's going on? And they would tell me basically what I just said, right? Well, we're brand new, we're volunteer driven, et cetera. And that makes sense to me, right? It kind of takes those red flags and knocks them down. But I do want to have that conversation with an agency to make sure that they have legitimate seeming, at least, explanations for why their 990 looks a little bit wonky like this. We're also going to look at the website, like I said. And this happens to be the website of the agency on the left here. This is their website. And so we're in this kind of weird gray area with COVID right now, but generally speaking, over the last couple of years, when I look at websites, a few things I'm looking at is, do they say something about COVID and how they're delivering services during COVID? Because that tells me that they're thinking about safety, of course, but also that they're keeping their website up to date, right? And so we see here at the very top, they're keeping their website up to date and they're thinking about COVID safety. We go down, look around a little bit more. We see donate now, get our newsletter, all of this stuff. That's all well and good. The thing that I'm really looking for also is this get help button in the bottom right. Do they make it easy for people in need, or for people like us who are referring people in need to do that, to get help, to be referred? And right down here, there's a tab for presumably either some sort of email form or a phone number, etc. That's super important. And then, of course, also they've got the what we do section kind of bottom middle here, so that if you're trying to do the investigation piece and figure out what agencies are available in my area and what do they do, they've got a section devoted to that. So I look at this website and I think, oh, this is a professionalized website. It tells people how to get help. It tells us what do they do. It is updated regularly, and they are thinking about safety amid a pandemic. That's all good stuff. I don't see any red flags on the front page of this website. Kind of at the other end of the spectrum, this is a different agency, obviously. And if we've got their mission statement right here, and this agency says that they educate and empower youth through service learning to meet the needs of others in their community so that every child has a sense of normalcy. So I read this and I think, I'm not sure I really understand what it is that this agency does, even though I just read their mission statement. It educates and empowers youth through service learning, but what does service learning really mean in this context? To meet the needs of others. Who are the others we're talking about? What does normalcy really mean? I mean, what is normal to me is probably not normal to you, and vice versa. So a lot of questions here. If we look at the top right on these tabs, we've got get involved, we've got donate, but you'll notice there is no get help section. So I'm kind of left wondering, well, what exactly is it that this organization does? And how do I get that service to people who need it? A lot of questions here. Again, much like with the 990 forms, however, I know from the outreach that I did with this community that this is also a legitimate agency. They are similarly to the one we discussed a few minutes ago, volunteer driven. They are run by folks who do not have professional backgrounds in the helping profession, social work, counseling, et cetera. These are mostly retirees who have chosen to do good work with the time and money that they have on hand in retirement. And so looking just at the website, it causes me some red flags, but that's an opportunity to have a conversation with this agency to say, hey, I looked at your website and I have a few questions. Can you help me out with this? It's not a reason to write them off. It's just a reason to have another conversation. So when we're getting to that part, when we're having that conversation of, is this a good fit for a partnership? Some of the things I might ask agencies, how much do you cost? Do you have sliding scale fees? Do you accept Medicaid? Are you free? What populations do you serve, right? If I serve at my library a disproportionately high number of Asian immigrants, and the agency calls me up and they say, we want to partner with you, and they serve mostly, let's say they do private practice therapy without a sliding scale and in English only, right? That is not necessarily a good agency for us to partner with. It's important to ask that question about the population that is typically served by those agencies, and compare and contrast that with the population that is served by your library. How do you work to address whatever stuff's going on with your patrons? Again, trying to look for goodness of fit. How do you involve your target population in the work that you do, in the programs that you design, in the research that you base your programs around? Because we want to make sure that the folks that we partner with are addressing the needs of the public on the public's own terms. For example, I've met numerous well-intentioned, warm-hearted people who want to start X, Y, and Z programs, classes, et cetera. I'll use an example of resume building. What I've heard has happened to some folks is that they think there are no kind of job help agencies in this town. We need that, especially for our high schoolers graduating who are not going to college. I will start a young adult resume building class at the library. Makes total sense on paper, right? But what often happens is that these young people then come to the class. Well, first of all, not many people show up because this population wasn't consulted about their needs. But the folks who do show up may actually not know how to use a computer. They may actually not know what resume means. They may bring their kids because they weren't able to secure childcare. And so all of these challenges pop up with low attendance, or you find out that you can't just jump into resume building. You actually need a computer skills class is what's really needed. And we want to partner with agencies who are doing the legwork in the community to design their services around the current needs of the community, and not what is imagined in the minds of people who are trying to start a program or start a class or that sort of thing. Also going to ask agencies if they're trauma informed, and if they say yes, I'm going to say, how so? Tell me how you do it. What does trauma informed mean to you? Tell me. As if that is a new term to you, we don't really have time to get into it too much today. But again, please email me, and we can talk a lot more about trauma-informed librarianship if you like. You'll have my email at the end of this presentation. Again, kind of in this COVID gray area right now, depending on the data in your community, you may or may not want to ask them about COVID and how they are handling that at this point. Certainly you want to ask them about service delivery and what that looks like right now. Is it online? Is it offline? Is it hybrid, et cetera? And I'm consistently surprised at how often social service providers and well-intentioned, intelligent folks forget that many low-income people still do not have consistent internet access at home. So if an agency has an application that is online only, we want to talk about that, because of course we can probably help people fill out those sorts of applications in our library, but what do they do if they want to do it at home? What do they do if maybe they're not comfortable coming to the library in person right now? We want to have that conversation as well. You know, how do you serve folks who don't have internet access? And make sure that that's something that they're thinking about. Also, you'll notice that a lot of these questions are open-ended, and that they usually start with who, what, where, why, and how. What populations? How do you work? How do you involve? Those are really important to use. And I'm going to actually talk about open-ended questions a little bit more in a few minutes. So red flags, and I don't want to scare anybody away from partnerships with these. The overwhelming majority of agencies and nonprofit professionals, in my experience, are ethical, good people. There's just red flags are often, like I said, they're not necessarily a reason to shut down a partnership, but they are a reason to have another conversation. And some of the things that I would consider red flags, you can guess based on what we've already talked about. If they say they're a 501c3 nonprofit and they can't prove it, that's obviously a problem. If they don't accept Medicaid or don't have any sliding scale fees, I think most public libraries are going to understand that a lot of our patrons with higher needs, their needs are higher in large part because their income is lower. And so an agency that doesn't accommodate low income folks, for me, is a red flag. Agencies that are dismissive of language around being trauma informed, or at the opposite end of the kind of trauma spectrum, resiliency, that, for me, that's a red flag. The author of the book that I mentioned earlier is dismissive of trauma informed language and person first language. So that is a red flag for me. Violating shared client patron confidentiality, and this is something I think we see in smaller communities, often from folks with good intentions. You know, again, we share our patrons as their clients and vice versa. And somebody may come to us and say, maybe they work in mental health, maybe they work at a hospital, and they say, oh, hey, have you seen Mr. So-and-so lately? He stopped taking his meds and he's been acting, you know, this and that and that. That, I think, is a question with the best of intentions. I'm worried about this person. However, it also invites us to violate that person's confidentiality. Saying they're off their meds already violates somebody's right to confidentiality in regards to the medication that they're taking. We don't want to, in turn, violate their right to confidentiality within the library and start describing their behavior without their consent. For me, that's a red flag. It's more of a red flag with that individual service provider, not the agency, but it is something to be mindful of. Cold calls, if people call you up and say they want to provide informational sessions, that is usually folks trying to make money. It's kind of funny, when I first began library social work 6 years ago and word was getting out that I existed and my position existed, I started getting cold calls from therapists, private practice, no sliding scale fee therapists, and insurance providers also, who wanted to give these informational sessions on self-care or a Medicaid or whatever. And at first you think, oh, this sounds great, but if you actually listen to a lot of what folks are saying, they're essentially trying to gin up business for themselves. They'll come in and say, here's an hour on how to do self-care. And oh, and by the way, I have a therapy practice and here's my business card. And for me, that's just not really the job of public libraries. I think that steps over the line into kind of promotion of for-profit services. And that's not the job of public libraries. Now, if a nonprofit were to come and say, we want to do an informational session for this free program that we offer, that's a different conversation. But these cold calls for informational sessions by for-profit insurance providers, therapists, et cetera, I usually give them a polite but firm no. Similarly, offers of high cost for-profit trainings for your staff, I would also caution against. There are many talented and smart helping professionals in libraries, myself included, who would probably be happy to offer you trainings for free or at a much lower cost than some of the folks out there are charging. Again, please feel free to reach out to me in regards to this. Happy to help. Too good to be true promises. It works with everyone. That was actually from the author of the book I mentioned earlier. If this stuff worked with everyone, then I would write the book and retire, right? Nothing works with everyone. That's the reason why we have to keep learning and trying new things all the time. And so that's a red flag for me. And then finally, tips on serving people, but particularly vulnerable people that are real heavy on scripts or if-then decision trees, that sort of thing. That's the complexity of the human life cannot be contained within a script. And I think that trainings that are designed around that sort of thing offer feelings of confidence with very little in the way of actual preparation. For me, this work is much more about developing lenses that help us see the world and see our clients' lives more accurately. They don't tell us exactly what to do, exactly what to say. I am very wary of any partnership with a provider or a trainer who wants to tell me that they know they can basically give me an algorithm to figure out how to interact with other people. I think at this point, we've all seen the repercussions of algorithms in social media and the repercussions of those. We do not want to turn ourselves into algorithms. So again, I recommend strongly against script heavy or decision tree style trainings. And this is Dikembe Mutombo over here on the right. If anybody's a basketball fan, as I am, specifically the Houston Rockets, he used to, after he would block a shot, he would wag his finger and say, no, 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 not today. He has a really, a really deep voice, unlike me. So again, another example from real life. When you're doing this research, here are two things. So both of these are descriptions of recovery, substance abuse recovery related agencies. And we can see Drake, the rapper, up here saying, no, no, to the first one, and yes, more of that, please, to the one on bottom. So we'll start with the no, no. This agency has a vision statement that says they are going to set the platinum standard for integrative transitional sober living recovery residences with focus on providing a minute to begin. So that's a huge red flag. Integrative transitional sober living recovery residences is a word salad that I don't understand. So that's another question mark. And focus on providing inspiring environments, amenities, and services. So when somebody is abusing substances, oftentimes that is due to a combination of or undertreated mental health issues and probably a trauma history. It is not due to a lack of inspiration or a lack of a swimming pool. This top vision statement frankly makes no sense to me. So if you see something like this, this is an agency which I would not actually have a conversation with. I would toss them out the door based on this alone. At the other end of the spectrum, different agency, also related to substance abuse recovery. Clients have the benefit of individual and small group counseling with, I know what those are, with master's level clinicians and licensed specialists. I know what those are at our treatment centers. Additionally, we have added a unique group of experience-based therapies specifically designed to help clients feel and experience the changes as they occur. I happen to know what and find out, and it's legit. Taken together, these four components, evidence-based practices, basically they're using research-based treatment modalities. That's a good thing. The experience-based treatment we discussed already. The individual and group counseling and 12 steps like AA, we know what that is. Form what we call this agency transformational treatment model, or this agency way. So you can see huge differences, right? Like it's almost laughable in how specific and research-based and licensed-based, like professional licensure-based, the bottom description is versus the top, right? And one that is run in a professionalized way on the bottom. All right, so now we're getting to the good stuff. We've vetted our partner. We're ready to sit down and say, how can we work together? How can we serve our community together? And some of the questions that I ask at this point are, what are our community's strengths? How can we build on those? How can we help you build on those? What information might we have that would be helpful to you? And vice versa. What are the greatest challenges facing our neighbors? Again, how can we help? How can we work together? How can the library help? A few examples, we might be able to publicize donation drives or to tweak messaging from our municipal governments. Obviously, we have lots of resources within our buildings, both in terms of space, programming, entertainment, staff expertise, you name it. What professional connections might be helpful to you in your work? That's a question from the library to the agency, because we're going to have an opportunity to potentially liaise between our other partners and the agency that we're currently talking to. But there's also an opportunity for or county departments. Most public libraries fall under the government. And I think it's an important, and yet we're also kind of different than, again, kind of what I was talking about in the ways we relate to our patrons. We're kind of different than most municipal government, able to kind of liaise between agencies and those other departments. I think specifically about the relationship between nonprofit employees and first responders, especially the police. Sometimes isn't how some of their clients get treated at the hands of first responders, and that causes some animosity. And there may be opportunities for us to kind of smooth things out if possible, or between even school districts sometimes and employees at nonprofits. And of course, what do our staff need to know about serving your clients? Which can lead to discussion. Yes. I'm going to turn off my camera because it sounds like looks like my audio is cutting out. Thank you, Caroline. What do we need to know about serving your clients? That can lead to some potential training opportunities. if they say, oh, well, let me give you an example. So I mentioned mental health first aid earlier. When I worked at the Georgetown Public Library, we were trained in mental health first aid from our version of our community health center, community mental health center. And they came and they were doing the training, and during a break, I was talking to one of the presenters, and he said, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm so glad that we're here. I bring my clients here all the time. And I said, who are your clients? And he said, I run a program for young men experiencing early onset psychosis. So it's serious mental illness kind of stuff. And he works with folks who are just experiencing it for the first time, usually hits us between 17 and 25. And he was bringing those young people to the library for some of those experience-based therapies that we mentioned earlier. And now, because we had been doing this outreach, the Georgetown Public Library staff knew that if Steve was in the building with someone and that someone happened to be exhibiting behaviors that we found a little strange or a little concerning, that we didn't need to be as concerned because they were with Steve and they were actually receiving mental health care at that moment in our library. And that's the sort of stuff that we can find by doing this sort of outreach. It helps. It's basically pre-escalation, right? If we see somebody exhibiting X, Y, and Z troubling behaviors, we kind of escalate a little bit, right? And a lot of us right now are thinking a lot about de-escalation, but I also like to think about pre-escalation, kind of escalation prevention. And I think that this is a good way to think about it. Like, I don't need to freak out about what's happening over here because that person is actually working with a mental health professional right now. And I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't been doing this sort of outreach in the community. And then, of course, like I said, how do we serve people experiencing early onset psychosis? Perhaps that's a little niche for its own full training, but I think you get the idea that this sort of outreach makes us go, oh, we didn't realize that we had 20 people with X issue coming into our library. Perhaps we should be trained in that. And you'll notice, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that all of these questions, much like the previous slide, are open-ended questions. They're those who, what, where, when, why questions. Open-ended questions cannot be answered with a yes or a no only. They have to have longer explanations. For those of you who do interviewing or hire folks, you probably know that open-ended questions are great in an interview because they give the opportunity to smart and thoughtful people who know what they're talking about to do just that, to say smart and thoughtful things, right? They also will trip up people who don't know what they're talking about and help us kind of filter them out. Open-ended questions are super useful in general. They're great at building relationships. They're great in this context because they help us find the folks who know what they're doing. And they encourage folks to be creative in the way that they answer questions. And those creative answers help us identify opportunities to grow the way that we serve our communities. And so as I kind of start to wrap up, and you move into this new work, perhaps new, perhaps not, just a few kind of reminders. This work is about relationships, right? And much like us, nonprofits, social service providers have been historically underfunded, understaffed, and overworked. And many of them are very much in that boat currently as well. So we want to keep that in mind as we kind of reach out to folks and give them some grace if folks maybe aren't as responsive as we would like, because again, we're trying to play the long game here and build a long-term working relationship with these agencies and with the individuals who work at these agencies. A lot of those task force and coalition meetings that I mentioned earlier may have moved online. They may be meeting less often. They may have changed. So again, we want to make sure that we're receiving up-to-date information on those meetings and when and where they're happening. Services may be different than before, much like our own. So we want to make sure that we're not basing our knowledge of community agencies off of what they did in 2018. We're basing it off of what they do now. This is a great time to reach out to maybe folks that you haven't talked to in a long time and say, hey, how you doing? Hanging in there? What are you doing at your agency? How are things looking these days? What's different? We're going to think about troubleshooting that internet access. Again, that comes up more often than you might expect. We're going to try not to add unnecessarily to the workload of agency employees, right? Just as we hate unnecessary work being dumped on us, so too do nonprofit employees. Sometimes I see from people in more powerful positions, kind of they want everyone at the table all at once. For example, at the height of the pandemic, lockdown time, I was coordinating a list of available resources in the city, and the city manager's office said, we want to have a meeting with the city manager and the executive directors from every nonprofit in town, and to find out what they need. And I told them, getting all of these people together at the same time online during a pandemic to talk about what they need is not a good use of their time. They all have lists of the things that they need on their Facebook pages and on their websites. This is a time suck for us and for them. We need to be mindful of the relationships we're trying to build with these nonprofit professionals, not adding unnecessary work to their plate, particularly during the height of a pandemic. And so sometimes we need to keep that in mind. And sometimes we may even need to push back on higher ups who fail to realize what I just described. Because again, this partnership work, for me, I'm a social worker, right? To me, it's all about relationships. The way we serve people, the way we partner with other agencies, the way we work with one another are about relationships. And it's just important to keep that in mind. Some of the things that we did when I was at the Georgetown Public Library that went well. We had our mobile library, our Words on Wheels, as we called it, the WOW, would visit free laundry nights. There was an organization that did free laundry nights at a local laundromat, and we would go. And initially, the idea was that we would have story time for the kids that were waiting on their parents to do laundry at the laundromat. But what we found is that the kiddos actually preferred to do arts and crafts. So we eventually moved in that direction. Worked great. Stole that idea from, I believe it was Brooklyn Public Library or New York City. I can't remember. I saw it on the PBS NewsHour that they were doing story time at the laundromat, and just stole that idea outright. We worked with the county domestic violence and sexual assault support agency, who would do intakes in our study rooms. As you maybe can imagine, if someone's a victim of abuse at home, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I'm taking the kids and going to the library for a couple hours than it is, and to literally go to the library, than it is to say, oh, I'm just going to go somewhere and then go to a domestic violence agency. So we were able to offer that to the domestic violence advocates to do intakes at the public library, and not require everybody to do them in person at their office. Narcan is an anti-opioid overdose medication, typically delivered as a nasal spray. You probably can get it for free in your community, perhaps from your community mental health center. It's super easy to use. I carry it in my bag and in my truck. Thankfully, I've not had to use it, but we had it in our building at Georgetown, and we were trained in the identification of opioid overdose and the use of Narcan by what's called in my county the mobile outreach team, which is a team made up of EMTs and mental health professionals that address mental health and addiction related calls. I supervise some interns at the library, some social work interns, master's level social work interns. They spent time with me in the library, and then they also spent some time serving folks in the schools. Actually, I had somebody embedded in an elementary school doing social work stuff with the little kiddos. And then I had another master's level social work student who Spent time working with an after-school program for kiddos experiencing homelessness. That's perhaps a bit specific to my library and the fact that I worked there, but that is just another example. We had a local basic needs agency distributing food in the parking lot 5 days a week. It was actually that same agency from before with the very short 990 form. Like I said, they are for real, despite the way that form looks. And they were doing brown bag lunches 5 days a week in our parking lot for anyone who asked, no questions, no strings attached, no questions asked. Social media campaigns highlighting the needs of nonprofits. We talked about that a little bit already. And I mentioned briefly keeping a living document as far as what service agencies are or are not providing at any given time. And of course, we're going to check websites and particularly social media, because that tends to kind of be updated, daily versus a website. And those sorts of kind of cheat sheets can be really useful to laminate and keep around the service desks at the public library, so that when people kind of keep a running list of your most frequently asked questions whose answers lie outside the walls of the library, put that on a laminated sheet of paper. I like to make it a certain color so that it stands out among the throng on the desk, something bright and that catches the eye. So that's another idea as well. So as I wrap up, here's my grumpy beagle looking grumpy as usual. And so as I've been talking about open-ended questions, trying to listen for opportunities, try and find strengths to build on, that sort of thing. I think oftentimes this work for me is about listening and listening for opportunities, listening for things that we might be able to help out with. And for me, that process calls to mind my dog, who, as you can see, is a hound dog, a scent hound. So if you have ever owned a bloodhound, basset hound, beagle, or similar dog, and you have a yard, you may know that when you let a scent hound into the yard, they don't just immediately make a beeline for necessarily a squirrel or their favorite spot in the yard or whatever. They kind of go out and they sniff around, and they sniff and they sniff and they sniff and they sniff, and they catch a scent, and then they follow that scent. And then they also go, burr, 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 and it's really funny, unless it's 6:30 in the morning and you got to run out and pick them up while you're in your underwear. Not that I've ever had to do that. But they are looking for that scent. They're looking for that opportunity. And then when it strikes, they are jumping on it and they're following it until the opportunity is over, or in our case, we want to drop the metaphor, until that program is up and running, or until that need is met and no longer needs to be addressed. So that's just kind of how I think about seeking out opportunities. Also, I think about my dog like all the time. So I believe, yeah, it's time for Q&A. Feel free, I think, if it's all right with Caroline, to unmute yourself if you like. You can email me at thepeloid@tsl.texas through the end of the month. I am leaving my position soon to teach full-time at the University of Texas at Austin School of Social Work. I'm really excited. I love teaching. I'm sorry to leave my full-time gig, but I fully intend to continue doing trainings like this one, and to continue consulting and answering questions as much as possible. I believe in this work. I believe in the opportunity that public libraries present in strengthening communities. So I'll be around. I just won't be available at this TSL texas.gov email soon, but please reach out to me either way and ask me any questions related to this presentation or just kind of people stuff in libraries. I'm happy to do so. And with that, I will take your questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for sharing your expertise with us today. We really appreciate your time.
So. Yeah, you're welcome.
And I will give everyone a moment to type or unmute. Do you have a link to the mental health first aid training?
I do. And I realize I'm sharing my screen with y'all, but I'm gonna keep doing it so that I can bring my contact information back up. But So I mean, if you just Google it like I did, this will tell you a lot right here. But if we're talking, you may need to find your own community mental health center, because usually these are not delivered statewide, although National Association for Mental Illness may be a good opportunity for that. So this is kind of the general 30,000 foot view of mental health first aid, and it will probably get you to what you need for your specific community. However, if you are able to locate either a local NAMI organization or that community mental health center, they should also probably be offering mental health first aid as well. We can see that mental health first aid is offered by NAMI right here. So there are a variety of ways to find it. But those are a couple. Again, if you run into roadblocks with either of those, let me know and I can help you figure it out.
And I see another question in the chat. How do you help smooth out any potential conflicts between the different audiences your library serves?
I'm guessing this is kind of a political question. Is that fair? Hearing nothing. I'm wondering. So yeah, so seniors who are wary of being around individuals who need social services. Well, I mean, between you and me, like all of us need social services. I think therapy and at minimum is something that we all need. So I think that's just some biases and stereotypes that exist in society, and those always exist. And there's, we're never going to eliminate that completely. And also a lot of the work that is done with these partnerships is not done loudly, right? If we partner with an agency who is going to come and provide, say, for example, grief and loss support groups at our agency, that's not something we're going to have balloons and signs for in the lobby, right? That's going to be an understated sort of a thing, probably up in one of our meeting rooms. And so there's that. But I think there's just always going to be unfortunately, an element of society who feel uncomfortable being around people with needs. And I don't know that we can smooth that out completely, other than to say that this is a public library and we serve all of the public. And no one is forced to be here. So if people feel uncomfortable around people with high needs or people experiencing homelessness, to Garrett's question, who complain about it, that to me, that is just privilege made uncomfortable. And to me, that is frankly just not a valid complaint. It's the world that we live. It's the world. It's humanity. It's what it is. It kind of is what it is. And so if folks want to complain about certain people or certain populations in the library, I typically just say, thank you for your concern, and leave it at that.
Any other questions? I'm going to add a link in the chat to our evaluation for our trainings. And so please fill out that survey and let us know any feedback or other trainings that you would like the State Library to hold. And I don't see any other questions, so last call if you'd like to unmute or type them in. All right. Well, thank you all for being here today. And thanks again, Patrick, for speaking with us. And you will all receive a follow-up email with the survey and recording probably early next week.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for being here, Caroline. Thanks for the invitation.
All right. Bye-bye.